You are aware. You can hear small sounds around you. Maybe the faint hum of a fan, the distant noise of traffic, or the subtle movement of air. You can feel the weight of your body pressing against the chair. You can notice your breathing. And while all of this is happening, thoughts are constantly appearing and disappearing in your mind. Some thoughts last only a second. Others stay longer. A memory might suddenly appear, or a question might quietly form inside your mind. And all of this creates a very powerful feeling that there is a you somewhere inside your head observing everything. It feels like there is a silent observer behind your eyes, a witness watching the world. This feeling is so natural that most people never question it. We grow up assuming that somewhere inside the body there is a center of identity, a core that experiences life, remembers the past, and moves through time as the same person. For thousands of years, humans have tried to give this feeling a name. Many cultures call it the soul. The soul is often imagined as the true self, something separate from the body that exists inside us. Something that sees through our eyes, listens through our ears, and somehow controls the physical machine we call the body. But if we want to examine this question the way a physicist would, we must begin in a different place. Instead of asking where the soul goes, we first have to ask a much more basic question. What exactly is a human being? From the perspective of physics, your body is made of atoms. An enormous number of them. Roughly 7 octillion atoms form the structure you call your body. That number is so large it is almost impossible to imagine. It is a 7 followed by 27 zeros. These atoms arrange themselves into molecules. Molecules combine to form cells. Cells gather together to form tissues, and tissues build organs. One of those organs performs something truly extraordinary, the brain. Inside your brain there are about 86 billion neurons. Each neuron is a tiny cell capable of sending electrical signals. But neurons do not work alone. Each one connects to thousands of others, forming a massive network of trillions of connections. Every second, electrical pulses travel through this network. Chemicals move between cells. Signals spread from one region of the brain to another in incredibly complex patterns. From the outside, this activity looks like a complicated electrical and chemical machine. But from the inside, it feels completely different. Those electrical signals are what create your thoughts. They produce your memories, your emotions, and your imagination. Every idea you have ever had corresponds to patterns of activity inside this network of neurons. Even the feeling that you exist, the sense that there is a you sitting behind your eyes, is connected to these patterns. And that leads to one of the most unsettling questions in science. If every thought, memory, and feeling corresponds to activity in the brain, then what exactly is the thing we call the self? Inside your brain there are roughly 86 billion neurons. Each one is a tiny living cell, smaller than the width of a human hair. On their own, a single neuron does almost nothing interesting. But neurons are not isolated. Each neuron forms connections with thousands of others, creating one of the most complex networks known in the universe. If you could shrink yourself down and travel inside the brain, what you would see would not look like thoughts or memories. It would look like an enormous storm of electrical activity. Neurons communicate using small electrical pulses. When a neuron becomes active, it sends a tiny electrical signal down a long extension called an axon. That signal travels until it reaches a microscopic gap between neurons called a synapse. At that gap, chemicals are released. These chemicals drift across the space and trigger the next neuron to fire its own electrical signal. This process happens again and again, spreading signals through vast networks of neurons. At any moment, billions of these signals are moving through the brain simultaneously. Patterns of electrical activity rise and fall, connect and disconnect, forming incredibly complicated circuits. Every thought you have is connected to one of these patterns. When you remember a childhood moment, a particular network of neurons becomes active. When you recognize a face, another network lights up. When you feel fear, joy, curiosity, or confusion, different patterns appear inside the brain. To a scientist observing from the outside, these events are purely physical. They can be measured. Electrodes can detect electrical signals. Brain scanners can observe which areas become active during different tasks. From this perspective, thinking looks like electricity moving through biological circuits. Yet from the inside, something very strange happens. These electrical signals do not feel like electricity. They feel like experience. When light enters your eyes, electrical signals travel through the optic nerve into the brain. Neurons process that information in layers of complex networks. To a physicist, this is simply the movement of charged particles and chemical reactions inside cells. But to you, it feels like seeing colors, shapes, and movement. The same is true for sound. Vibrations in the air strike your ears and become electrical signals traveling through neurons. The brain processes those signals in intricate patterns. Yet what you experience is music, voices, and meaning. This gap between the physical description and the lived experience is one of the deepest mysteries in science. Physics can describe the electrical signals with incredible precision. Neuroscience can map the networks of neurons and measure their activity. Scientists can even predict which regions of the brain will activate when you perform certain tasks. But explaining why these signals produce a conscious observer remains extremely difficult. Why should electrical pulses feel like anything at all? Why does a pattern of neural activity create the sense of being someone who is observing the world? At the moment, no scientific theory fully explains this. Some scientists believe consciousness emerges from extremely complex networks of information processing. Others think that certain patterns of activity create feedback loops that generate awareness. But even with these ideas, the mystery remains only partially solved. All we know with certainty is that every aspect of our mental life corresponds to activity inside the brain. When the brain changes, the mind changes. Damage a small area of the brain, and a person might lose the ability to speak. Damage another region, and memories may disappear. Certain injuries can even change personality. These observations suggest something important. The self we experience is deeply tied to the physical structure and activity of the brain. And this realization leads us to a very strange possibility about what the self might actually be. To understand this strange possibility, it helps to look at something very simple in nature. Imagine standing on a bridge above a river. The water flows steadily beneath you, moving around rocks and curves in the landscape. As you watch the water, you notice a swirling motion forming in one spot. The water spins in a circle, creating a small whirlpool. At first glance, the whirlpool seems like an object. You can point to it and say, there it is. It appears to have a location and a shape. It looks almost like a thing floating in the water. But if you look more carefully, something unusual becomes clear. The whirlpool is not made of any particular water molecules. The water that forms the whirlpool is constantly changing. New molecules flow into it every second, while others flow out and continue down the river. The particles that make up the whirlpool right now will not be the same particles that form it a few seconds later. Yet the whirlpool still appears to exist as a stable structure. How can that be possible? The answer is that the whirlpool is not actually an object at all. It is a pattern of motion. The flowing water and the shape of the river create conditions that allow a rotating pattern to appear. As long as those conditions remain stable, the pattern continues. When the flow of water changes, the whirlpool disappears. Nothing mysterious leaves the river when this happens. The water remains exactly where it was. The molecules continue to move through the system. Only the organized pattern that created the whirlpool is gone. This idea appears again and again throughout nature. Consider a flame burning on a candle. The flame looks like a stable object. It flickers in place and produces light and heat. But a flame is not a fixed piece of matter. The molecules inside a flame are constantly changing. Wax molecules evaporate, oxygen from the air reacts with them, and the resulting chemical reactions release energy in the form of heat and light. As long as the chemical reactions continue, the flame exists. Blow out the candle and the flame disappears instantly. But the atoms involved in the reaction are still present in the air. Nothing has vanished from the universe. Only the pattern of reactions that produced the flame has ended. Even something as massive as a hurricane works in a similar way. A hurricane looks like a gigantic spinning object moving across the ocean. Yet it is not made of a fixed set of air molecules. Air constantly flows in and out of the storm. The structure persists only because energy from warm ocean water maintains the circulation. If the energy source disappears, The hurricane weakens and eventually dissolves. The same principle may apply to the human mind. Your brain is a physical system made of atoms and molecules that are constantly moving and changing. Neurons fire electrical signals. Chemicals flow through microscopic pathways. Proteins are built and broken down. Cells repair themselves and replace their components over time. In fact, many of the molecules inside your brain today were not there a few months ago. The body continuously recycles and replaces its materials through metabolism. Yet your sense of identity remains surprisingly stable. You still feel like the same person you were yesterday, last year, or even 10 years ago. Memories connect the present moment to the past. Your personality maintains recognizable patterns of behavior and thought. This suggests that the self may not be tied to any specific atoms in the brain. Instead, the self may be a pattern created by the activity of those atoms. A dynamic structure formed by electrical signals and chemical reactions moving through neural networks. Just like the whirlpool exists as a pattern in flowing water, the mind may exist as a pattern within the activity of the brain. As long as the pattern continues, the sense of self continues. And this idea leads to a very important question. What happens to that pattern when the brain can no longer maintain it? To explore that question, it helps to think carefully about what actually happens inside the body when life ends. In everyday language, people often describe death as if something suddenly leaves the body. It sounds dramatic, almost like a departure. But if we examine the process from the perspective of physics and biology, the events are quieter and more mechanical. The brain is an organ that depends on a constant flow of energy. Every neuron inside it requires oxygen and nutrients delivered by blood. These resources allow cells to maintain electrical signals, pump ions across membranes, and transmit chemical messages to neighboring neurons. The entire system is like an intricate electrical network powered by a steady supply of energy. When that supply stops, the system begins to fail. If blood flow to the brain is interrupted, oxygen levels begin to fall almost immediately. Within seconds, neurons start losing their ability to maintain the electrical balance that allows them to fire signals. Ion pumps that normally regulate the movement of charged particles across cell membranes begin to shut down. Electrical activity becomes unstable. For a short time, neurons may fire in chaotic bursts as the system loses control. But this state does not last long. Without oxygen, the chemical processes that power brain cells cannot continue. Within a few minutes, the organized electrical patterns that normally move through the brain begin to collapse. The brain itself is still there. The cells have not vanished. The atoms that form the structure of the brain remain in place. But the coordinated activity that once allowed billions of neurons to communicate with each other fades away. The difference between a living brain and a non-functioning brain is not primarily the presence of atoms. It is the presence of organized activity. To understand this better, imagine a city at night. Thousands of buildings stand side by side, filled with electrical wiring machines and communication systems. When the power grid is running, lights glow in windows, traffic signals change colors, computers exchange information, and people move through the streets. Now imagine the entire power supply to the city suddenly shuts down. The buildings are still standing, the roads are still there. The wires and machines still exist exactly where they were. But the activity that once filled the city disappears. Lights go dark. Signals stop changing. Communication systems fall silent. The structure remains, but the dynamic processes that made the city alive with activity have ended. Something similar happens in the brain when it can no longer sustain its electrical patterns. The physical structure remains for some time, but the coordinated activity that produced thought, memory, and awareness no longer occurs. At that moment, the patterns that formed the mind dissolve. It is important to notice that nothing mysterious is seen leaving the body during this process. Scientists who measure brain activity observe signals gradually fading away. Instruments that detect electrical patterns show silence where there was once complex activity. The atoms that formed the brain continue to exist. The energy stored in the body slowly spreads into the environment as heat. Molecules begin to break apart and participate in new chemical reactions over time. From the viewpoint of physics, the universe continues to follow its ordinary laws. Matter changes form, energy spreads, and systems move toward more stable conditions. What disappears is not the material of the brain, but the organized pattern of activity that once existed within it. And if the mind truly is a pattern sustained by that activity, then the end of those processes would mean the end of the pattern that produced the experience of being someone. To understand why complex patterns eventually disappear, we need to look at one of the most important ideas in physics. This idea is called entropy. Entropy is a way of describing how ordered or disordered a system is. In simple terms, it measures how many possible arrangements the particles in a system can have. Imagine a brand new deck of playing cards arranged perfectly in order from ace to king. The cards follow a very specific pattern. There is only one arrangement that produces that exact sequence. Because of this, the system is highly ordered. Now imagine shuffling the deck randomly. After a few seconds of shuffling, the cards will be in some mixed order. In fact, there are trillions upon trillions of possible ways the cards could be arranged. Almost all of those arrangements look random. This means there are far more disordered arrangements than ordered ones. Nature tends to move towards situations that have more possible arrangements. In other words, systems naturally move toward greater disorder. This tendency appears everywhere in the physical world. If you drop a glass cup onto the floor, it shatters into many pieces. The shards scatter in different directions, and tiny vibrations spread through the air and the ground. Heat is produced during the impact. Now imagine trying to reverse that event. Picture all the tiny pieces sliding across the floor, jumping upward, fitting perfectly together, and forming a smooth, intact cup again. Physics does not forbid this event. The atoms inside the broken pieces still exist. If every particle moved in exactly the right way at exactly the right moment, the cup could theoretically rebuild itself. But the probability of that happening is unimaginably small. There are countless ways for the pieces to remain scattered, but only one precise arrangement that forms the original cup. Because of this, the scattered state is overwhelmingly more likely. This is why we always see the cup break, but we never see the pieces reassemble. The same principle applies to many processes in nature. Ice melts in warm air. The water molecules spread out and move more freely. But we never see warm water spontaneously gather itself and form a perfect ice cube on a table. Perfume sprayed into a room slowly spreads until the scent fills the space. The molecules drift through the air and mix with the surrounding atmosphere. But we never see the molecules suddenly collect themselves back into the bottle. In each case, the system moves from a more ordered arrangement to a more disordered one. Your brain is one of the most ordered systems known to exist. Billions of neurons must fire in carefully coordinated patterns. Electrical signals must travel along precise pathways. Chemical reactions must occur at the right places and the right times. The entire system depends on a constant supply of energy from the body. This continuous energy flow allows the brain to maintain its delicate structure of activity. But the universe has a general tendency toward increasing entropy. Without energy to maintain complex structures, systems gradually relax into simpler and more disordered states. When the brain stops receiving energy, the organized electrical patterns that once existed cannot be sustained. Neurons lose their ability to maintain electrical gradients. Chemical balances begin to change. Signals that once traveled across networks no longer occur. The incredibly precise patterns that supported thought and awareness slowly dissolve. It is similar to what happens when a whirlpool disappears after the current of a river weakens. The water does not vanish. The molecules continue moving through the river, but the organized spinning pattern fades away. Or consider a sandcastle built on a beach. As long as someone maintains its shape, the structure remains. But if it is left alone, wind and waves gradually erode the walls and towers. The grains of sand spread out across the beach. Nothing magical has happened to the sand. The particles simply moved into more common and more stable arrangements. The same idea applies to the incredibly complex structure of the brain. Maintaining that level of organization requires energy, constant repair, and active regulation. When those processes stop, the brain becomes just another physical system following the ordinary rules of thermodynamics. The atoms remain part of the universe. But the highly ordered patterns that once formed the mind slowly fade into simpler arrangements. And this leads to a deeper and more unsettling question about the nature of consciousness itself. If we follow this line of reasoning carefully, a quiet but unsettling conclusion begins to appear. The question people often ask is, where does the self go? But physics approaches the problem in a different way. Instead of assuming that the self is an object that travels somewhere, physics asks whether the self might be something else entirely. To see why this matters, consider another simple example. Think about a computer running a complex program. When the program is active, the screen shows images, text, and motion. Information flows through circuits inside the machine. The computer processes instructions, stores data, and performs calculations. Now imagine that the power to the computer is suddenly turned off. The hardware is still sitting on the desk. The processor, memory chips, and circuits have not disappeared. The atoms inside the machine remain exactly where they were a moment before. But the program that was running is no longer active. Where did the program go? It did not fly out of the computer into the room. It did not travel to some hidden location. The pattern of electrical activity that represented the program simply stopped. The instructions still exist as patterns stored on a disk or in memory, but the dynamic process of executing those instructions has ended. Without electrical activity moving through the circuits, the program is no longer happening. Something similar may occur in the brain. The mind can be thought of as an extremely complex pattern of activity occurring inside neural networks. Electrical signals travel through billions of connections. Information moves from one region of the brain to another. Signals combine, interact, and influence future signals in intricate ways. This activity forms a constantly changing pattern that produces thoughts, memories, perceptions, and decisions. As long as the pattern continues, the experience of being a conscious self continues. But if the activity stops, the pattern stops. The atoms that make up the brain remain present. The molecules are still there. But the coordinated electrical processes that produce the experience of awareness are no longer occurring. In this sense, the question of where the self goes may be similar to asking where a flame goes after a candle is blown out. The flame seems like an object while it burns. It has shape, brightness, and movement. But it is really a continuous chemical process. Fuel reacts with oxygen, releasing energy as heat and light. When the reaction stops, the flame disappears. The atoms involved in the reaction remain in the air as gases and particles. Energy spreads into the environment, but the process that created the visible flame has ended. The same reasoning suggests that the mind might not be a permanent substance hidden inside the brain. Instead, it could be a temporary event created by ongoing physical processes. Your thoughts exist only while certain patterns of electrical activity occur in neural circuits. Memories exist as specific arrangements of connections between neurons. Emotions correspond to chemical signals and patterns of activity across different brain regions. As long as these processes continue, the mind exists as a dynamic system. When the processes stop, the system no longer produces conscious experience. This idea feels uncomfortable because our everyday intuition tells us that the self should behave like an object. We imagine it as something that occupies the body and must go somewhere when the body stops working. But nature contains many examples where what appears to be an object is actually a process. A flame, a whirlpool, a hurricane, or a wave in the ocean all seem like separate things, yet each one is simply a pattern maintained by flows of energy and matter. Remove the energy source or change the conditions, and the pattern disappears. Nothing leaves the universe when this happens. The underlying particles remain. Only the organized behavior that created the pattern is gone. If consciousness is a similar kind of process, then the end of brain activity would not involve a departure or movement. It would simply be the moment when the physical processes that supported awareness stop taking place. And yet, even if this explanation describes what happens physically, it leaves us facing a much deeper mystery about the nature of consciousness itself. Even if we accept that consciousness is a pattern created by physical processes in the brain, the mystery is far from solved. The brain can be mapped, measured, and monitored in incredible detail. Scientists can track which neurons fire when we see a color, hear a sound, or feel an emotion. They can predict the general patterns of activity that correspond to movement, memory, or language. Entire networks of the brain can be visualized as lines, nodes, and circuits using modern imaging technology. Yet none of these measurements explain why these physical processes feel like anything from the inside. Electrical pulses, chemical gradients, and protein interactions exist independently of our perception of them. But when arranged in just the right way, they produce the phenomenon of awareness, a subjective experience that includes the feeling of being alive, thinking and observing. This gap between what the brain does and what we experience is often called the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem is not just a philosophical curiosity. It points to a real scientific question that remains unsolved. Why do patterns of matter and energy give rise to a first-person perspective? Why should neural activity create something that feels like life rather than being entirely silent and mechanical? Some theories suggest that consciousness emerges from extremely complex patterns of information processing. According to these ideas, when the network of neurons reaches a certain threshold of complexity, awareness arises as an emergent property. This is similar to how a whirlpool emerges from flowing water. The whirlpool is not a separate entity from the water. It is a pattern of motion that exists only while the water flows in a certain way. The pattern can disappear without any water molecules leaving the system. Other theories focus on feedback loops within the brain. In this view, consciousness arises when certain neural circuits monitor and respond to other circuits, creating a self-referential loop. This feedback produces the experience of being someone who is aware of the world. While these models can describe aspects of conscious experience, they still do not fully explain why physical processes should ever feel like anything at all. The brain also has the remarkable ability to maintain continuity over time. Atoms within the brain are constantly replaced through metabolic processes, yet people generally experience themselves as continuous individuals over years and decades. Memories, personality traits, and the sense of self are preserved even as the underlying material changes. This reinforces the idea that consciousness is not tied to specific atoms, but is instead a dynamic pattern of activity. If consciousness is truly a pattern rather than a thing, then when the brain stops functioning, the pattern ceases. The atoms remain in the universe, the energy dissipates, and chemical processes continue in other forms. But the organized system that allowed you to perceive the world, reflect on your thoughts, and experience yourself as a distinct entity is gone. This conclusion is unsettling because it challenges a deeply held intuition, the feeling that there is a permanent you inside the body that continues independently of physical processes. Our brains evolved to understand the world in terms of objects. We naturally think of the self as a persistent entity that moves through time, but if consciousness is a pattern, it behaves differently from ordinary objects. It can exist, flourish and vanish without the movement of matter from one place to another. The mind is a temporary island of organization in a universe that tends toward disorder. While it exists, it observes processes and experiences reality. When it ends, it leaves no trace of itself in the form we recognize, even though its constituent atoms continue their journey. This realization forces us to reconsider the nature of identity, life, and the self. Consciousness may not be an eternal passenger riding inside a physical vessel. Instead, it may be a fleeting pattern, an emergent phenomenon, and one of the rarest and most remarkable events in the cosmos. The story of consciousness becomes even more remarkable when we consider the origin of the very atoms that make up our bodies and brains. Every atom in your body has a history that stretches back billions of years, long before life existed on Earth. Carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, iron, and other essential elements were forged inside the cores of ancient stars through nuclear fusion. These stars lived for millions of years, burning through their fuel. And eventually some exploded as supernovae, scattering their atoms across space. These atoms traveled through the cosmos, drifting in clouds of gas and dust, eventually forming new stars, planets, and solar systems. Some of these atoms became part of our planet, settling into oceans, rocks, and the atmosphere. Over billions of years, chemical reactions gave rise to the first living cells, simple organisms that reproduced, evolved, and gradually became more complex. Through an incredibly long chain of events, life evolved on Earth, creating plants, animals, and eventually humans. And somewhere along this chain, a particular combination of these ancient atoms formed a human brain. This brain was capable of sustaining patterns of activity that could process information, form memories, experience emotions, and, most remarkably, become aware of itself. For a brief moment in the history of the cosmos, atoms that were once part of exploding stars assembled into a structure capable of asking profound questions. What am I? Why do I exist? How does the universe work? This realization is deeply humbling. The atoms inside you have been part of countless processes, flowing through the universe for eons. They were never yours in a permanent sense. They were once stars, gas clouds, and molecules in ancient oceans. Yet, for a short period, they became part of something extraordinary, a pattern of matter that is aware of itself and the world around it. The universe, which is mostly indifferent and vast beyond comprehension, has for a brief moment organized itself in a way that allows it to look at itself through your consciousness. The experience of being alive is not a given. It is a rare and fleeting arrangement of matter, energy, and information that temporarily produces self-awareness. This pattern exists only while the physical processes of the brain continue. When the energy and activity cease, the pattern collapses and the conscious experience ends. This does not diminish the value or significance of life. On the contrary, it highlights just how astonishing and fragile consciousness is. For a tiny fraction of cosmic time, the universe has produced a structure capable of observing, reflecting, and understanding itself. That structure is you right now. Every memory you hold, every thought you think, and every sensation you experience is the result of these patterns. When the processes stop, consciousness as you know it disappears, but the atoms that made up your body and brain continue on, participating in new chemical reactions, forming new structures, and eventually becoming part of other systems in the universe. Energy and matter are conserved, but the particular pattern that created you is gone forever. This perspective forces a shift in how we understand the self. It is not an eternal, unchanging object. It is not something separate from the physical universe. It is a transient, dynamic pattern that emerges from complex interactions among billions of neurons, each of which is made of atoms with a history spanning billions of years. The you that exists at this moment is a fleeting arrangement of matter and energy that will eventually disperse, leaving only traces in the wider flow of the universe. In this light, the human experience becomes a temporary miracle of organization in a universe governed by physical laws. Consciousness is a pattern of extraordinary rarity, arising only under precise conditions, lasting only while those conditions persist. It is a brief window in which the universe becomes aware of itself. Understanding this, we see life not as something permanent but as a fleeting, astonishing dance of matter and energy, and ourselves as temporary patterns capable of witnessing the vast cosmos from the inside. If we take all of these ideas together, the question of where the soul goes transforms into a deeper and more fascinating inquiry. Traditional ways of thinking imagine the self as a thing that can move, travel, or survive independently of the body. Physics and biology suggest something very different. The self may not be a separate object at all. Instead, it may be a dynamic pattern, a process that exists only while certain conditions are maintained. The mind is not a fixed entity embedded in the brain. It is a complex organization of matter and energy, maintained by electrical activity in neurons and chemical signaling across networks. Memories, thoughts, and emotions are patterns encoded within this system, not objects that can detach or escape. Just like a flame relies on chemical reactions to exist, consciousness relies on ongoing neural processes. When those processes stop, the pattern collapses and the conscious experience ends. This does not mean that life is meaningless or insignificant. On the contrary, it highlights the extraordinary rarity and fragility of consciousness. For a brief period, atoms that once existed in stars, oceans, and clouds come together in just the right arrangement to produce awareness. For a short window in cosmic time, the universe is able to observe itself through the patterns formed in your brain. The fact that this happens at all is remarkable. Most matter in the universe will never experience self-awareness. Most patterns of energy will never become conscious. And yet here you are, reading, thinking, and perceiving right now. Even more astonishing is that this pattern is entirely dependent on precise conditions. Every moment, your brain must maintain billions of coordinated signals. Neurons must fire in the correct order. Chemicals must flow properly. Energy must be supplied consistently. Slight disruptions can alter the pattern, changing memory, personality, or even awareness itself. Consciousness exists in a delicate balance, a temporary island of order in a universe that tends toward disorder. When the brain stops functioning, the pattern that created your awareness does not travel to another location or enter some other realm. The atoms remain in the universe, participating in new chemical reactions, forming new molecules, perhaps becoming part of other living systems or inanimate structures. Energy and information are conserved in the physical sense, but the specific organization that produced the self is gone, the you. That exists at this moment is unique in all of history. That pattern will never occur in the exact same way again. This perspective changes how we see reality. Consciousness is not a permanent object. It is a fleeting phenomenon, a temporary event created by matter arranged in a highly specific, extraordinarily complex way. Life is not about preserving an eternal soul, but about the astonishing fact that the universe has, for a moment, produced a structure capable of observing itself. The fleeting nature of consciousness can inspire a profound sense of awe. Every experience, every sensation, every thought is part of a rare pattern unfolding in the universe. The atoms in your body were once part of stars, and through billions of years of cosmic evolution, they have formed a structure capable of self-awareness. The universe has become conscious for a brief moment through you. Understanding this, the question of where the soul goes is no longer about travel or survival after death. It is about recognizing the remarkable nature of what consciousness is, a temporary, unique, and extraordinary pattern that emerges from matter, allowing the universe to witness itself. In that sense, life itself becomes a fleeting miracle, a dance of atoms and energy that for a moment produces the profound phenomenon of awareness. Every thought, every observation, and every memory is a testament to the rare and fleeting capacity of the universe to know itself.